Hey everybody, and welcome to the 11th episode of the Level Creation Guide for Half-Life. In the previous episode, we learned how to use environment entities to add a unique layer of detail to our levels. In this episode, we're going to be learning about level transitions and how to use them to connect our levels. One of the features that makes the Half-Life experience unique is how the player traverses from level to level. Instead of being isolated from each other, most of its levels are almost seamlessly stitched together, offering the illusion of environment continuity and the ability for the player to backtrack. For this episode, we're going to be using two test levels named Map A and Map B. They are mirrored images of each other, containing their own info player start and light entities. We will be switching between both of these test levels within Jack during this episode and editing them. Let's begin this episode by learning how to create a two-way level transition. Starting with Map A opened, use the block tool and create a full wall in the lower half of our inner hallway. Next, apply the AAA texture to the entire block. Then, with our block still selected, press Ctrl-T to transform it into an entity. Once transformed, change it into the Trigger Change Level entity. The trigger change level behaves similar to other trigger entities. Upon contact, this entity will load and transfer the player to a chosen level. Looking at its attributes section, the only options we should concern ourselves with right now is the new map name and landmark options. Starting with the new map name option, this is where we enter the level's name we wish for the player to be transferred to. Since we're in Map A, and our second test level's name is Map B, let's enter our second test level's name, Map B, into this option. Let's now move on to the landmark name option. This is where we place our info landmark entity's name into. Since we have not created this entity yet, let's create our future landmark entity's name, Landmark01, into this option. Once entered, we can now exit this entity and create the info landmark entity. Within our innermost hallway, use the entity tool and create the info landmark entity. The info landmark entity acts as a corresponding point for the trigger change level entity to seamlessly transfer the player to a new level. Within its attributes section, the only option present is the name option. Let's add our prior created name, Landmark01, into this option. Once entered, we can exit this entity. Next, use the selection tool and position our info landmark entity to be in the exact middle of our inner hallway. Lastly, let's select both of our trigger change level and info landmark entities and copy them by pressing Ctrl-C. There we go. Our trigger change level and its needed info landmark entity are now configured within Map A. We will now need to switch to Map B to complete our level transition. To switch to Map B, click on the Window tab at the top of Jack and select Map B from its menu. Once selected, we will be within Map B and able to continue and finish our level transition. While aiming in the top viewport within our middle hallway, press Ctrl-V to paste our copied entities. After being pasted, double-click on our trigger change level entity to enter into its entity browser. Then, select the new map name setting and change it from Map B to Map A. This will allow us to travel back to Map A from Map B. Once changed, exit the entity. Let's now reposition our trigger change level entity to be in the upper half of our inner hallway. This will prevent both of our trigger change level entities in Map A and B from interfering with each other and causing them to break. Next, let's double-click on our info landmark entity to enter into its entity browser. As an important note, the name of our info landmark entities within Map A and B need to share the same name for our level transition to work properly. Since this info landmark entity is a copy, it will have the same name, so we won't need to edit it, and we can exit this entity. Lastly, be sure our info landmark entity is positioned in the exact middle of our inner hallway as it was in Map A. Since it already is, we won't need to make any changes. Awesome work! Both of our test levels now have the entities required to make a level transition. We will now need to compile both of our levels in order to playtest them. Since we left off in Map B, let's compile it first. To compile, press F9 and select the Don't Run Game setting. This will allow us to compile the level without needing to open up the game. Let's press OK and wait for the level to finish compiling. Once finished, let's now switch to and do this for Map A. Select the Window tab at the top of Jack and select Map A. Within Map A, let's press F9, but this time, deselect the Don't Run Game setting so we can load into our level once compiling is finished. Let's then press OK to compile and playtest our levels. Great job! Our level transition is working and we're able to travel between both levels. Now that we've learned how to create a two-way, how about a one-way level transition? Fortunately, this is very easy to do. Let's say we don't want the player to be able to return to Map A from within Map B.
You shall not pass!
All we need to do is make Map B's trigger change level entity be inaccessible to the player. We can achieve this by simply repositioning our trigger change level entity in Map B to be outside behind our walls within the void and thus out of the player's reach. However, in-game this isn't really elegant and there are more inventive ways of creating a one-way level transition. A common and more graceful way is to simply create a drop where the player must fall into in order to progress, but will be unable to jump high enough to return. Let's implement this drop one-way level transition into our test levels, starting with Map B. Use the Selection tool and, while aiming in the top viewport, drag Select across the first third of our hallway. Then, right-click on our selection outline to open up the small menu. 3 unique selection options, named Touching, Inside, and Handle, will be available for us to choose from. The Touching option will select everything touching our outlined selection. The Inside option will only select blocks and entities that are fully within our outlined selection. The Handle option will only select blocks and entities whose handle, or those little small marks located on every block and entity, are within the selection. All 3 of these options are useful, and can save us a lot of time from manually selecting large parts of our level. Let's use the touching option to select everything touching our selection outline. Now that we have our entire first third of our hallway selected, here's where we're going to have our drop occur. However, we'll need to use the clipping tool to make a total of 4 cuts across these blocks so we can wall in our corner without affecting the hallways it's connected to. Let's begin with the first cut. Select the clipping tool and use the top viewport to drag-click a cut along the first indicated line. Use Shift-X to have both sides of the cut highlighted white to not delete any blocks once cut. Once ready, press Enter to cut. Let's continue and drag-click a cut along the second indicated cut line. Once ready, press Enter to cut. Now for the third cut. Drag-click a cut across the third indicated cut line and press Enter to cut. Time for our last cut. Drag-click a cut across the fourth indicated cut line and press Enter to cut. There we go. Our corner drop walls and ceiling are now ready to be adjusted. Let's start by selecting our north and east wall and increase their height to be 256 units tall. Then, select our ceiling block and move it to the top of our new wall height. Next, select our southern ceiling block and increase its height to be 128 units tall. Now, let's click on our selection tool and use the top viewport to drag-click across our first portion of our hallway. Right-click on our selection to open up the small menu, and instead of using the touching option, let's use the handles option. With our hallway now selected, let's use the side viewport to move it up to be level with the height of our bottom walls. Once positioned, select this western floor block and adjust its size to seal in our corner drop. Be sure to seal in any holes in our hallway to avoid producing leaks. Let's now do some texturing. Use the Advanced Texture tool and select all 4 walls in our corner drop. Press on the Texture Browse button and find this texture. Double-click on this texture and use the Apply Texture button to apply this texture to our selected walls. Awesome work! Our corner is now properly textured and complete. Let's continue and texture any block with incorrect textures. Let's now group our first hallway and corner together and copy them for Map A. Use the Selection tool again in the top viewport to drag-click a selection across our hallway and corner drop. Right-click on our selection to bring up the small menu, and press the Handles option. With our hallway and corner drops selected, press Ctrl-G to group them together, and then press Ctrl-C to copy them. Let's now select our Trigger Change Level entity and position it outside our walls so the player will not be able to activate it. Before we move on to Map A, let's compile Map B by pressing F9, selecting the Don't Run Game setting, and pressing OK. Once compiling is finished, we can exit the compiler and select the Windows tab at the top of Jack and click on Map A. Let's now continue and create our drop within Map A. First, let's adjust or delete any hallway blocks and entities between our room and corner. Once cleared, aim in the top viewport and press Ctrl V to paste our copied entities. Then, position our newly pasted hallway between our room and corner. Next, adjust any blocks colliding with our new hallway. And don't forget about the ceiling. Now, use the selection tool and the top viewport to drag-click a selection only across our room. Right-click it to bring up the small menu, and select the Handles option. Use the side viewport and move our selected room up to be level with our upper hallway. Delete any unnecessary blocks and fix any holes in our hallway. Let's do a quick last inspection for any texture issues or leaks. Once finished, we can now playtest by pressing F9, deselecting the Don't Run Game option, and clicking OK. Good job, we've successfully created a one-way level transition. We are now ready to move on to the last part of this episode. We're going to be learning about the final type of level transitions called displacement. Unlike the previous two level transitions, displacement level transitions simply transfer the player to a new level without regard to the environment continuity. An example of this within Half-Life is the ending of the Lambda Core chapter, where the player must survive against many alien controllers within the bowels of the Black Mesa facility before entering a portal and appearing in the alien world of Zen. To implement a displacement level transition is very easy. For our test levels, we could simply create a button at the end of our room in Map B and have it transfer the player back to the room in Map A. However, this isn't too elegant of a way of creating a level transition. Instead, let's create a displacement level transition involving a teleporter. In order to make it as organized and as simple as possible, here's a quick rundown of the teleport displacement level transition we'll soon be creating. Within Map B, the player will walk onto an orange glowing teleporter pad block and activate a new entity called the Trigger Teleport entity. The Trigger Teleport will then teleport the player immediately to the location of another new entity called the Info Teleport Destination entity. This entity will be located within a small, player-sized white textured room containing a flickering light and info landmark entity. Upon the player's arrival in this room, a trigger multiple will be tripped and activate a multi-manager entity. This multi-manager will then tell an ambient generic to play a teleporter sound effect. Then, after a couple of seconds, the multi-manager will activate a trigger change level to transfer the player to Map A. Within Map A, the player will appear in the main room at the location of an info landmark entity and activate a multi-manager entity. This multi-manager will activate another new entity called the Environment Fade to fade the player's screen from black. It will also tell an ambient generic to play another teleporter sound effect. With this last activation, our teleport displacement level transition will be concluded. In an additional effort to make this last section of the episode as organized as possible, I have placed a counter in the bottom right indicating how far along we are. With that said, let's continue and create this teleport displacement level transition starting within Map B. Let's begin by creating a small player-sized room. Use the block tool and create an 80 unit tall, 64 unit wide, and 64 unit deep block outside our main room. Next, use the selection tool to select our newly made block. Then, press on the Browse Texture button located on the right-hand side of Jack. Type white into the texture search bar and double-click on this texture. Then, press the Apply Texture button to apply this texture to the entire block. While still selecting our now white textured block, right-click on it to bring up this menu. From this menu, select the Make Hollow option. Change the value from 16 to the value of -8. Once changed, press OK to make our white textured block hollow. Now that our small, player-sized room is created and textured, let's now create its flickering green light. Use the Entity tool and create the light entity. Within its attribute section, select the brightness option and choose this green color. Then, select the appearance option and set it to the fluorescent flicker setting. Once set, exit the entity. Let's now position our flickering green light entity to be center in our small room. Our small player-sized room is now complete. Let's move on and create the teleporter pad. Use the block tool and create an 8 unit tall, 64 unit wide, and 64 unit deep block in the middle of our main room. Next, use the Advanced Texture tool and apply this texture to the top face of this block. You may need to use the Align Center button to position the texture properly. Let's now apply this texture to the remaining faces. And exit the Advanced Texture tool once finished. Our teleporter pad block is now created. Let's continue and create a sprite entity for it. Use the Entity tool and create the environment sprite entity on top of our teleporter pad. Within its attribute section, click on the Render Mode option and select the Additive option. Next, select the FX Amount option and enter in the value of 255 for full visibility. Then, click on the Sprite Name option, click on the 3 dot icon, and choose the Enter One sprite. Let's now select the scale option and reduce our sprite's size by setting it to the value of 0.75. Once set, we can exit this entity. Our teleporter pad is almost complete. As the final detail, let's create a light entity to make our teleporter pad emit an orange glow. Let's use the Entity tool and create the light entity. Within its attributes section, select the brightness option and lower the value from 200 to 100 to reduce how bright our light is. Next, let's click on the Pick Color button and choose an orange color. With our color chosen, we can exit this entity. Let's now position our orange light entity to be in the center of our sprite entity. Great work! Our teleporter pad is now complete. Time for us to create our teleporter entities. Use the Block tool and create a 64 unit tall, 16 unit wide, and 16 unit deep block. Once created, use the Selection tool to select our newly created block. Then, click on the Browse Texture button on the right-hand side of Jack and apply the AAA texture to the entire block. Next, reposition our block to be on top of and center of our teleporter pad. Then, while still selecting our block, press Ctrl-T to transform it into an entity and change it into the Trigger Teleporter entity. The Trigger Teleporter entity is just as it sounds. Upon player contact, it will teleport the player to the location of a chosen Info Teleport Destination entity. Within its attributes section, the only option we need to adjust is the Target option. This is where we place our aforementioned Info Teleport Destination entity's name into. Since we have not created this entity yet, let's enter its future name, TeleDes01, into this option. Once entered, we can exit this entity. Now that our Trigger Teleport is created, let's now create the Info Teleport Destination entity. Use the Entity tool and create the Info Teleport Destination entity within our main room. The Info Teleport Destination entity is simply the location of where the player will be teleported to by the Trigger Teleport entity. The only options within its attributes section are the Pitch Yaw Roll and Name option. The Pitch Yaw Roll option controls the direction of where the player will face upon arrival. This can also be set by using this compass. Since it doesn't matter what direction the player will be facing in our small room, we can keep this default setting. Lastly is the Name option. Let's enter its prior created name, TeleDes01, into this option. Once entered, exit this entity. Let's now use the Selection tool to position our Info Teleport Destination entity to be center and on the floor within our small room. With our teleport entities now created, let's carry on and create a second pair of trigger changelevel and info landmark entities by duplicating the original pair. Use the selection tool, select both our original trigger changelevel and info landmark entities. Hold down the Shift key and right-click a copy away toward our main room. With our second pair of trigger changelevel and info landmark entities created, let's now edit them. Let's start by double-clicking on our trigger changelevel entity to enter into its entity browser. We'll need to add a name to this entity so we can control it later with a multi-manager entity. Select the name option and enter in the name Change01. With our name entered, select the landmark name option. We will need to change our landmark's name or else the player will appear at the location of the original info landmark in Map A. Let's change its name from Landmark 01 to Landmark 02. Once entered, let's select the Change Target option. This option allows us to activate an entity in the level the player is transferred to. Since we want a multi-manager to activate an ambient generic and environment fade entity upon the player's arrival, we'll need to add the not yet created Map A's multi-manager's name into this option. Let's create and add the name mmenter01 into this option. Once added, we can exit this entity. Let's now edit our duplicated info landmark entity. Double-click onto our info landmark entity to enter into its entity browser. Select the name option and change its name from Landmark 01 to Landmark 02. Once entered, we can exit this entity. The second pair of our trigger changelevel and info landmark entities are almost complete. Let's now move them both to be in proper positions. First, let's use the selection tool and position our trigger changelevel entity to be outside behind our small room. Lastly, select our info landmark entity and position it to be in the center of our small player-sized room. Our changelevel entities are now complete. Let's carry on and create a sound effect for our teleporter. Use the Entity tool and create the ambient generic entity next to our teleporter pad. Within its attributes section, let's start with the name option and give it the name Sound01. Next, select the wave name option and click on the 3 dots button. With the sound directory open, enter into the debris folder and choose the beamstart7.wave file. Here's how it sounds. Let's then enter into the flag section and enable the Play Everywhere, Start Silent, and Not Toggled options. The Not Toggled flag setting is particularly important, as if enabled, the sound will play upon every activation, instead of switching between playing and not playing. With that said, and these flag settings enabled, we can exit this entity. Now that our ambient generic is complete, let's continue and create our multi-manager entity. Use the Entity tool and create the multi-manager entity next to our teleporter pad. Within its attributes section, let's select its name option and add the name mm01 into this option. Next, click on the Smart Edit button and then press on the Add button. The first entity we'll want to activate upon the player's arrival to our small room is our ambient generic entity. Let's add its name Sound01 into the key setting and then enter 0 into the value option. Once entered, press OK. Now, the next and last entity we want to activate in Map B is our Trigger Changelevel entity. Let's click on the Add button again and enter its name, Change01, into the key setting and 2 into the value option. Once entered, we can press OK and then exit this entity. With our multi-manager created and set up, all we need is to create a trigger entity to activate it once a player arrives in the small room. Let's use the block tool and create a block within our small room. Since our block is already textured with the AAA texture, we won't need to texture our block and can continue transforming it into an entity. Let's now select our newly created block and press Ctrl-T to transform it into the Trigger Multiple entity. Within its attributes section, select the Smart Edit button first to revert the options to being regular. Next, select on the Target option and enter our multi-manager's name, MM01, into this option. Lastly, select the Delay Before Reset option and set it from 10 to 3 to allow us to reactivate this entity sooner for repeated use. Once set, we can exit this entity. Awesome work! We're almost finished with Map B. Before we move on to Map A, there are a couple final things we need to do. First, let's select our multi-manager, ambient generic, trigger changelevel, and info landmark entities. With these entities selected, press Ctrl-C to copy them. Once copied, the last thing we need to do is compile Map B. Press F9, select the Don't Run Game option, and press OK. Once finished, we can now exit the compiler. Let's move on to Map A by clicking the Window tab at the top of Jack and selecting Map A. Now that we are within Map A, let's paste our copied entities. Use the top viewport and press Ctrl-V to paste our 4 copied entities within and level with our main room. First, let's reposition our trigger changelevel entity to be outside our main room. Next, select our info landmark entity and place it in the same position as our info player start. Now, let's reposition our ambient generic and multi-manager entities to be away from the info player start. Then, double-click on our multi-manager entity to open up its entity browser. Within its attributes section, let's change its name from MM01 to MMEnter01. Once changed, click on the Smart Edit button. Next, select the Change 01 entry and press Delete to remove it. Then, press the Add button and enter in our soon-to-be created environment fade entity's name, Fade01, into the key option. Enter 0 into the value option and press OK. Once finished, exit the entity. Our copied entities are now complete. Let's create the final entity we're going to be learning and using this episode, called the Environment Fade entity. Use the Entity tool and create the Environment Fade entity. The Environment Fade entity allows us to fade the player's screen from or to a specified chosen color. Before we review the Environment Fade's attribute section, let's click on the Smart Edit button to revert it to being regular. Within the attribute section are 5 relevant and useful options to adjust. Starting with the Name option, let's add our prior created name, Fade01, into this option. Next is the Duration option. This controls how long it will take to fade to or from a specified color. Let's keep the default value of 2 into this option. Moving on to the Hold Fade option, this controls how long the screen will stay on the specified color. Let's also keep this option at its default value of 0. Next is the Fade Alpha option. This sets the maximum opacity of the specified color from 255 being solid and 1 being almost completely transparent. Let's also keep this option at the default value of 255. Lastly is the Fade Color option. Here we can set the color of our fade effect. Again, let's keep this option at its default value of 000, which is just black. Moving on to the Flag section, let's enable the Fade From setting so the player's screen will fade from black. Once enabled, we can exit this entity. With our environment fade now set up, our teleport displacement level transition is now complete. Let's do a final playtest and see how it works in game. Let's press F9, deselect the Don't Run Game option, and press OK. Congratulations, you've successfully learned how to create level transitions. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. As always, if you have any questions, be sure to comment below and I'll try my best to help. I hope to see you next time in the 12th and final episode of the Level Creation Guide for Half-Life.